We're now going to session 4, How Business is Coping with Changing Relations, a CEO Conversation. Our speakers, Mary Kay Magistad of Global Voices, she is moderating. Ernie Thrasher, our Global Trustee and CEO of Xcoal Energy and Resource. Roberta Lipson, founder of United Family Healthcare and Vice Chair of New Frontier Health. And Ken Wilcox, our Honorary Chair and the author of the new book, The China Business Conundrum. Ensure that win-win doesn't mean Western companies lose twice. This is also the last chance for audience Q&A for the public portion of our conference. We have until 1:15. Mary Kay.
Thank you, Margaret, and hope you all had a good lunch and some time to chat and exchange ideas. Obviously, one of the ideas that came up in the previous panel was, while there are challenges in the U.S.-China relationship, significant ones, while there has been a recalibration of who's investing in China and who's reconsidering the risks and opportunities of investing in China, there's still a lot of U.S. investors in China. There's still a lot of U.S.-China trade. But just to give a couple of points of data, there are many. The State Department's Investment Climate Report in 2024 ranked China the 11th most restrictive out of 89 countries surveyed in terms of the general investment climate. And in a September survey, so September 2024, by the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, less than half of those surveyed expressed optimism about business prospects in China over the next 5 years, which was the lowest level of confidence expressed in that survey in its 25-year history. And just 37% said they expect their company's China revenue growth to outpace global growth in the next 3 to 5 years. 2/3 already said they were following a de-risking strategy. Also, interestingly, many said, given the topic of our panel, many also said that tensions in the U.S.-China relationship is the biggest challenge to their China operations. And when asked how the U.S. government could better support American companies in China, almost half suggested reducing tariffs on Chinese goods. But in general, it's a complicated picture. And I'm going to start with a question to Ken that gets at the complicated nature of both the relationship in general and also the specifics of each company, each CEO, and the business they're doing with China. Because in each case, it's its own story. So Ken, in your book, well, let me start by saying, when I was preparing for this panel, I was kind of looking at a number of different things. One of them was actually looking at a video of a panel that was done on the same subject 5 years ago for this conference. You were on the panel, so was Anya, actually. And the tone was, it was actually remarkable as a time capsule because the tone was quite positive. And it was during the Trump administration. It was in the last year of the Trump administration. We were just starting to hear about this thing called COVID coming out of China, and it just still seemed a distant disease. And you said, we need each other, the US and China, and that in general, there's still people, the US investors you talk to want more access, more business in China, even as they also want more protection from some of the challenges that they face when they go into China. Your book reads more like a cautionary tale, and there's one particular thing that jumped out at me. You said that, one second. For US businesses in China, you said many different things, so this is just one quote taken out of context, so I'll leave it to you to provide more balance. But you said, of US companies in China, many have failed, many others are in the long, slow process of eventually failing. Many who will eventually fail are not yet even aware of the fact that over the long haul, they cannot win. So how has your thinking about your experience in China, you lived there from 2011 through 2014, helping set up Silicon Valley banks, joint venture in Shanghai, which did then continue for 6 years. How has your thinking about all this evolved over time?
Well, if I may not say the same thing 2 days in a row, it's explainable by human nature. First of all, hope springs eternal. And the other thing is, I didn't write this book in a single day. I wrote it over about 10 years, in some sense over 14 years, because when we got to China at the beginning of 2011, I started the practice of journaling, meaning every couple of nights I would sit down with myself and I'd write for a half an hour. And what I was writing about was my theory of China. I tried to keep an open mind and to look for factual evidence that would give me a sense of how does China work. I would write things down. I would also write down intended courses of action, and then I would go out and test them. And often as not, in another week or two, I had to correct some of my beliefs, and I had to change my course of action. So when we got back at the end of 2014, I had a stack of papers about that thick. And I let it just sit there and ferment for 5 years. And during those 5 years, I literally spent almost every waking hour either with the Asia Society or the Asian Art Museum or the 21st Century China Center or with my Chinese tutor. And after a long period of fermentation, the COVID came, and there was nothing to do but write. So that's how that book happened. And I would like to just give you the headlines so that because I don't anticipate everybody will read it, but I don't want you to go away with a false impression. My book is not an indictment of China or of Chinese people. And it is also not a call to decouple. I still believe we need each other. It's a description of the obstacles that we faced in building our joint venture bank. In China, we were in 4 or 5 locations, all of the usual suspects. And our purpose was to support the development of technology in China. But I will say that our joint venture partner, the Chinese Communist Party, can be a difficult joint venture partner and put up numerous obstacles. And it was always baffling to me, why are we being told to hurry up and stop? And why are we being told to stop? And most particularly, and I won't dwell on this, but why, as soon as we got our license, were we told that we could not use Chinese currency for 3 years? Which in my mind is like saying, here's a license to start a restaurant, but you can't use food for 3 years. So if you were to ask me, who do I blame? Actually, the book spends more time blaming us than it does the Chinese Communist Party. And that's because I believe in any relationship, the only person you can change is yourself. There's no way on earth I could change the Chinese Communist Party, but I can criticize the way that I'm dealing with it and perhaps do better. So I would like to just list where the guilt goes, in my opinion. On the China side, I think that China, at least in this past several years, has been gratuitously hostile toward us. If you were to read Wang Yi's speeches, as I do, you have the feeling that you could buy him an ice cream cone and he'd complain. He never has anything nice to say about the U.S. It is uniformly critical. I also think that it would have been better if Xi had hired Deng's publicity consultant, because I think his public relations are really not very good. And I also would blame him for refusing to rebalance the economy. I'm not an economist, but the legitimate economists in the audience have already said that. And that's part of my complaint as well. So that's not a very long list of complaints. What are my complaints about us? One, I think that corporate leadership in the US, including myself, pushed somewhat by Wall Street, have spent too much time shipping manufacturing jobs into other countries, and that puts us in a precarious situation today and does not help us get along with China. And I count myself in that because when I was CEO, but it was quite a while ago, I did my best to move a few hundred analytic positions, which are the banking form of manufacturing, to India, not to China. But nevertheless, there were that many fewer jobs for Americans. That's number one. Number two, I think we are guilty of having superimposed our beliefs on China. Never superimpose your beliefs on other people because you don't know what they think or what they aspire to. And when we spent 25 years saying, and I can fault specific leaders, but I'll just make the general comment, saying that if we are nice to China, they're going to become just like us. I've never seen that work on a one-to-one basis, so I don't see why it would work on a country-to-country basis. Number three, I do not think that we prepare ourselves for operating in China as well as we could. Most of the people in my age bracket were schooled in getting to yes, and we failed to realize that not everybody takes that approach to negotiation. I believe that the Chinese Communist Party has a totally different approach to negotiation. It's largely about identifying your leverage and applying it. And if you fail to identify your leverage and apply it, the party is likely to think you're either stupid or something and view you as vulnerable and a prime target for manipulation. I believe we're guilty of not having held the Chinese Communist Party responsible for living up to not necessarily the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law with respect to WTO. When I was told that we couldn't use currency for 3 years, Chinese currency, I went immediately to the Fed, because I'd been on the Fed board here in San Francisco for actually 7 years. I knew a lot of people. I whined, and the response was, we're not here to protect you. You went to China on your own, and you have to live with your sleep in the bed you made. And they were very explicit about that. And I said, you've given a handful of Chinese banks charters to operate in the US. Why didn't you deny them access to American currency for 3 years? And they scoffed at me. And then finally, I think we're guilty of, because I have studied so many companies, that's what bankers do, study companies. That's more or less our job. So many companies that have gone to China and suffered the application of what I call the ARC. And I'll tell you what the ARC is, but they refuse to admit it. And if they only admitted it and wrote books about it, we could read them and we could prepare ourselves. And that's why I wrote this book. And not to condemn China, but to prepare people who want to go there for what they may, not always, but may encounter. And the ARC, and this is where I'll finish, is very simple. If you're doing something that the Chinese Communist Party thinks they would like to learn from, that it would benefit China if they could learn from what you do, they will, number one, is solicit you with flattery. I was told by even one member of the standing committee that I was the smartest American he'd ever met, and that our bank was more important than any other in the world, including, I hope there's one of you here to take the insult, including Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. They'll stoop to that level to get you to come. And then once you get there, pave the way for your license, but then tie you up with regulation so that you really can't do what you came to do. And then spend time observing you. For the 3 years when we couldn't use Chinese currency, every day almost, maybe every week, I'm exaggerating. Maybe every week though, I was encouraged by somebody in the party to share my business model with the Bank of Beijing or 20 other different banks. And then at the end of 3 years, they came to me with a big smile and said, we're so happy that 3 years have elapsed. We are now in a position to grant you permission to use renminbi. And by the way, we so admire your business model that we've decided to use it ourselves. We're starting a brand new bank in Shanghai in another 2 weeks. It's called Huarui Bank. It's going to use your business model. And would you be so kind as to stay a little longer and sit with the executives of Huarui Bank and explain to them some of the things that they don't really understand?
So has your business model had staying power in China after Silicon Valley Bank left? I mean, like, has it actually worked without Silicon Valley Bank being there to be the joint venture partner?
Well, that's not a nice question. If nothing else, I'm willing to admit that I was wrong. We never should have taken our business model to China in the first place. It doesn't even fit. Our business model, among other things, depends on regulatory bodies that close bad banks. There's never been a bad bank in China that's been closed. They just quietly recapitalize bad banks. They put all of the bad loans into a dumpster and then into a landfill. And the people who pay for the recapitalization, mainly citizens, generally speaking, aren't even aware that the bank's being recapitalized. And Andy's sitting right there, one of my old colleagues. I think you'll agree, part of our business model has been the fact that the Fed closes banks that lose too much money. And we were the only people, or almost the only, there were 2 or 3 others out of thousands and thousands of banks. There were only 2 or 3 competitors because everybody else was afraid to do what we did. And if we had learned how to walk the line, if they had tried to walk the line, would-be competitors, most of them fell off and got in trouble. And competitors in China don't get in any trouble.
Yeah. So Roberta, you have founded 2 companies in China yourself, first Chindex importing medical equipment, and then the wildly successful United Family Hospitals, where, full disclosure, I was a regular, that's where I got my checkups. I am grateful to this day for the care in the emergency room in Beijing United when I got pneumonia in a very polluted part of China's coal mining country. So there are, what, 11 hospitals now, including in Hong Kong.
Clinics in Hong Kong, yes.
Yeah, and you have, you've been in China for 45 years.
Yes.
How did you make it work back in the 80s when you were first starting your first company, and then into the 90s with Beijing United and United Family Hospitals? And how have the challenges changed? Like, if you were to do the same thing now,
Right.
how would the environment be different?
So I think in the 80s, there was huge opportunity for American investment, and the Chinese government recognized that and was very anxious for American investment. So if you had a good idea that filled a niche that the government also agreed was a niche that needed filling, it was an opportunity. And first mover advantage is so important, I think, in Chinese consumers' minds. The big challenge in those days was the rules weren't written, and you had to be willing to accept a certain amount of uncertainty and sort of cross the river together with the regulators while feeling the stones. I think now, you mentioned that almost 50% of the Shanghai American Chamber of Commerce members were not optimistic about the future, but there are still 50% who are optimistic about the future. No question about the fact that the economy is facing some hard times. That having been said, there are some corners of the economy that are still doing pretty well in China, and high-end healthcare services happen to be one of them. But there are other areas of the service economy that are also doing well. Of our members at AmCham China, that's the Beijing national side of AmCham, very few of the companies are trying to divest. Some of them de-risking by making some investments elsewhere, but many of them, as mentioned in one of the earlier panels, are continuing to invest in China. And some of the success of the companies that are doing really well are coming from, unlike when they first invested, for example, in the manufacturing sector, when they first invested, they were investing for re-export to the United States. Then they were in China for China. And now where the growth is coming from for the manufacturing sector is in China for the rest of the world, not necessarily exporting back to the US, but exporting to the rest of the world. And they still see that as a real, absolutely important reason to be in China, not only because they have the investment in the manufacturing base there, where they can compete, they can also really know their Chinese competition and also export for a good cost basis of their products. So there's still a lot of optimism, and if you believe that the Chinese economy isn't going to be in a downward spiral forever, you can take advantage of the fact that the government really does recognize that they are in great need of foreign investment again. Not only for the purpose of employing their people, but maybe as important to show the confidence of the global investment community that there is confidence in the future. And so I think that there's opportunity. The opportunities are different, and it's a matter of taking a look at the market and what can we bring to it, what can it bring to us. But the aspect of concerns of American companies in China, biggest concern being the U.S.-China relationship and geopolitics, I think that's absolutely true. And we are all wondering about the future. None of us know what the next administration is going to bring for the bilateral relationship, including the trade relationship, including the space given to American companies to trade and invest. So I think that something that it took back then of being willing to take risk and being willing to nimbly pivot based on what comes our way, I think we're all thinking that way. And I believe the Chinese government is also thinking that way and doing their scenario planning. But that doesn't mean we're frozen. Yeah. And so also the Chinese government, and I want to share this, has for the last year and a half working really hard to show that they're continuing to make progress on their WTO obligations. They're continuing to take industries off of the negative list, including my own, has just had a liberalization. And they're continuing to want to do everything they can to incentivize foreign investment. So there's a little bit of a contradiction because recently a new policy came out forbidding local governments to make differential incentive deals for investing, not only foreign invested companies, but also domestic investments that differ from the national policy priority. So it ties the hands of the local governments a little bit, but we see local governments reaching out like they haven't reached out since the 80s, frankly, in a really proactive way to attract investment.
And just one quick follow-up before I go to Ernie. The United Family Hospitals have now been running in China for 30 years. What impact do you think they've made on local healthcare?
Frankly, I'm proud of the fact that the public system looks at our model and tries to emulate it. It's not easy. I mean, they have other challenges that we don't have, and their burden is great, and they lose money all the time, no matter what they do. But we have seen the level of quality and service improve in public hospitals, and like any other industry, even if we look at them as a potential competitor, you need to stay ahead of your competition. And you can't imagine that your competition's not going to want to try to emulate best practices. And if you're the best practice they're trying to emulate, all the power to you. Just keep ahead. Keep keeping ahead.
Yeah.
I think.
So Ernie, you have been going into China for over the course of roughly 3 decades?
Since 1988.
88. Part of that was before you founded Xcoal.
Xcoal, correct.
Why don't you describe briefly what Xcoal is doing in China now?
Yeah, so interestingly, for 20 years, I was involved in exporting products from China. And then it was only since 2009 that I've been involved importing products to China.
And this is to support the steel industry.
Support the steel industry. Previously, it was Chinese exports of raw materials and resources to support the global steel industry. So China went from being an exporter of products to an importer of products. Today, we, on a much lower scale than we once were transacting in China, but we continue to supply U.S. and Australian coal and various ores, primarily for the Chinese steel industry.
And what led to the decrease of imports?
First of all, in my personal view, the industrial boom in China has peaked and the economy is changing, so heavy industry is not what's driving the economy today. A lot of that industrial overcapacity that Wendy mentioned is in the steel industry and the cement industry, industries that consume a lot of coal and other energy products. And then the U.S., because of its geographical disadvantage, has to compete with products from other sources. And then recently, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and sanctions on Russian energy products, many of those products are now going to China because China's taking advantage of the discount on Russian energy products.
So China, of course, has a lot of its own coal.
Correct.
Are you sending in a particular kind of coal?
Yeah, and again, because you have to do what you can compete in or what you're good at. China produces 4.5 billion tons of coal. The world consumes about 8 billion. So 4.5 billion of that is produced in China. The U.S. at one time produced 1 billion tons of coal. Now it's 540 million. But in 2024, China will import 500 million tons of coal. So, we have more competition than we once had. My company, myself, and the U.S. coal industry in general, we were impacted significantly by the U.S.-China trade dispute from 2018 to 2020. U.S. coal had a 33% tariff imposed on it for pure political reasons, because the Chinese government felt President Trump at the time got a lot of political support from the coal-producing states. So we were forced to find other areas to sell our products just for survival.
So the Chinese government has pledged to reach peak emissions by 2030 and be net neutral in CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 2060. In absolute terms, emissions are still increasing. But in the energy mix for electricity, there was actually a drop in the proportion that went to coal this past year. It went from 60% down to 53% as renewable energy went up. So it sounds like, China's
playing with figures.
China's reached peak industry maybe, but I've also heard you say that we've reached peak coal as a world, but also that you feel there's a long tail.
Correct. Well, we've seen the challenges with the energy transition in the United States with a much more advanced economy and much more plentiful supplies of energy. But China has very little gas, natural gas. They depend on Russia for most of their gas imports. So they have to burn coal until they find another solution. And although the percentage of coal in the energy mix has declined, the total amount of coal continues to increase. And China continues to build coal-fired power plants. I get into some very interesting debates about basically the divergence between what China says they're doing and what they're doing. And they are so far from being on any path to peak emissions and or net zero. And of course, no one's really defined what net zero means. It means different things to different people. But as recently as summer of 2023, Xi Jinping said we're suspending our decarbonization efforts to ensure we have energy for our country.
Right.
So,
but they're also racing ahead with renewable energy, taking on board more renewable energy.
they are racing ahead, but as I have said, you have to be careful because they use the terms like the renewable energy has reached a certain capacity. But when you look at the capacity factors of renewable energy versus the capacity factors of fossil fuel energy, the amount of renewable energy is nowhere near what they would want you to believe.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes before we're going to turn to you for your questions, so keep them in mind. Let me just go down the line and ask each of you what you expect, how you expect your sector to, or how you know your sector to be adjusting given what the next 4 years may hold for U.S.-China relations. And for you, particularly for your company, how are you staying agile to deal with whatever may happen?
I still have the scars from picking up the last hot horseshoe in 2018. So I'm very, very cautious about what the trade dispute or potential trade dispute may be. And I think it's going to be very challenging for at least my sector to, and that means both energy or coal, LNG, whatever it may be, very challenging to participate. But having said that, and again, I'll refer to something Wendy said about the previous phase one trade agreement, much of that trade in the phase one and the proposed phase two trade agreement was based on significant amounts of energy being exported from the US to China. So I have a mix of, I had to be very cautious not to make the same mistake that I made previously and get harmed, but I can't shut the door and miss the opportunity on what a trade agreement may provide to me. So it's.
And Roberta, let me expand the question a little bit for you, both about what you're doing, but also to put on your other hat that you were wearing until the end of the year. You had been the chair of the American Chamber of Commerce, China in Beijing. And during your tenure, you're saying that the Chinese government was actually quite open to meeting with members of the chamber in negotiations, or not negotiations, but representing different issues and looking for some kind of change on the ground. I think there were 100 or so meetings and like 39 or so.
Ministerial level.
We're at ministerial level.
Yes.
What would you hope that AmCham's able to do, both in terms of lobbying the U.S. government and the Chinese government in these next 4 years?
Yeah, so I think that the AmCham Voice for Business was extremely important, especially during the time that the governments weren't speaking to each other so much. So we felt that it was very important to lend our own voices to deliver the messages both on the China side and the US side about how, what kind of support business needed and what kind of liberalizations might be helpful in general for the relationship. But in addition to speaking to the government, I think we saw the preservation of people-to-people contacts as equally as important. Seeing students in China, US students in China going from 15,000 pre-pandemic down to 300 during the pandemic, and now maybe back up to about 1,000 or so. We're worried about the future level of expertise on the American side to deal with China. So talking to the Chinese government about opening the border, encouraging more students, getting more business people directly over. So we talk about things like increasing flights because that's standing in the way. We've seen in the last few months visa-free entry for 10 days for Americans, which I think is going to be really good for business. Because frankly, I think part of the mutual demonization has come due to disengagement. And when you demonize the other side, it's kind of hard to see any good in them. And I think it could lead to some very dangerous things, trade-wise, Cold War-wise, hot war-wise. And so that engagement to me is just so important. And we've seen a really interesting phenomenon over the last few days, and probably some of you have seen it with the American social community being afraid of losing their TikTok connections. They've been going on the Little Red Book on Xiaohongshu. And people are saying things like Americans, just everyday influencer Americans, saying, wow, Chinese people are so funny. They're like fun, and I thought they were just evil. And so we really suffered from that disengagement in terms of misunderstanding the humanity of each other. And Americans are reading about China through the filter of press who were summarily kicked out over the last few years. And that's got to breed some resentment. But even if they're doing their best for objective reporting, they haven't had on-the-ground experience in, 3, 4, 5 years. This is dangerous. And we talk to the Chinese government all the time about inviting the journalists back in, increasing the number of flights, bringing in students. And there's a commitment to bring in 50,000 American students over the last 3 years. They're really doing it. They're putting their money where their mouth is on that. And I hope the US government will be open to it.
Yeah. Let me let Ken get got some support here in the room.
Some.
So very briefly, Ken, in the tech and innovation sector, we've already heard some talk about this at the conference, but what's your sense of what's possible at this point in terms of collaboration or competition?
Well, I wish you'd said the financial services sector, because that's a little easier to predict.
Okay, go ahead.
Meaning, over and over again in the 20 years, actually 24 now, that I've been involved in the financial services sector in China, I've seen promises of an opening. And we get our hopes up and we start doing what we need to do to prepare. And then the promises of the opening turn out to be head fakes. So I would not anticipate that promises of opening in the financial services sector will end up materializing. That would be number one. And by the way, historically, foreign banks have not done well in China. Yeah. They just haven't. And we thought we might be an exception because we were a very strong force in Israel and in Europe, and at least a fledgling strong force in India. And so we felt that it was almost our duty, because technology is a global industry.
We need to get to questions. That's a really important point, and hopefully we'll have another chance to come back at the end. But I do want to leave time for you guys to ask questions. Who has questions? Okay, I see a hand up over here.
Hello. You mentioned the arc of the Chinese wanting value from foreign companies going there, and you talked about this sort of illusory goal of financial service liberalization in China. What do you see as the carrot for them allowing in foreign banks? It seems like maybe there's not enough of a carrot for them to ever allow it, and thus the decades of delay. Do you think that will change, or do you think foreign banks have something to offer China that they haven't gotten yet?
I think that some foreign banks have something to offer China. I don't think there's any doubt about that. In particular, in the investment banking sector, some foreign banks, Goldman Sachs by way of example, Morgan Stanley potentially have something to offer China. Most foreign banks don't have much to offer China. And the carrot in our case was, which sadly I didn't find out until I'd been there for over a year, somehow the CCP believed that we had an algorithm that enabled us to differentiate between startups that were going to be successful and startups that weren't going to be successful. And I think they were confusing us with Wells Fargo's small business. In any case, they were sorely disappointed when they found out there was no algorithm. So I think that answers it.
Other questions? Yeah, right in the middle. There's one coming.
This question is probably for Ernie Thrasher. You talked a lot about coal. I think our new Bay Bridge is mostly made from Chinese steel. I could be wrong, but I think most of it is Chinese steel. Can you describe what happened to steel production in the United States and why we're losing out to China and Japan?
Yeah, I grew up near Pittsburgh, so I lived the devastation of the U.S. steel industry. I think a big portion of the problem with the U.S. steel industry was lack of investment and lack of innovation. So some of this goes to what Ken says. A lot of the blame of the decimation of the U.S. steel industry falls on ourselves. And I would draw the analogy to the U.S. auto industry, which was on its back when Toyota came to the U.S., and then the U.S. auto industry flourished because it had to compete with Toyota, and it made itself better. So we have the natural resources. We should be one of the leading steel producers in the world. And my personal view is, having been in the area when it happened, management got complacent, and you had a mistrust between the workforce and management, and it went on a death spiral. So still hope, but I think we have to solve our own problem there.
So complicated, as with much of what we've been talking about. Sadly, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, all of you, for your insights. Thank you for your attention.